Hello, I am Kelly Lewis,
And I'm Tiffany Jones.
and this is the fourth time we have recorded this intro because we're so bad at it. But we are your revenue insiders, and we are so excited to launch our new mini series all about
Playbook, the
our
playbook,
playbook. Yes,
Kelly,
playbook. Thank
our
you, Tiffany.
playbook for annual planning.
Yes. And this is a topic that I think most of you are probably thinking about right now. So
Yes.
excited to bring in some amazing experts to talk about all things annual planning. But before we do, Tiffany, I want to shout out big thank you. Tiffany came and saw me at my last keynote at High Spot
I
this
know.
week. She sat in the front row.
It's funny. I think the only time I've actually seen you speak in person. I mean, I feel like when we're talking here, it sort of counts, but yeah, it was really fun to see you speak in person and kind of sad it's your last High Spot
No,
Spark event. But I also spoke at Spark and you did not come see me. And my team didn't even take any photos of me. I got
no.
one. I got one photo.
So, yes, Tiffany spoke and I did not show up. I did have client
Okay.
meetings. That was the reason. It was a good reason.
Fair enough. Fair
But
enough.
I ambushed your team when I saw them in the halls
They
at
told me
Spark later and asked them for all the photos, and they had none. So, you're
they had
right.
none. They said their excuse was that it was such a riveting speech, and I feel like they were just like, they had to say that. So it's okay. I don't hold it. I don't hold it against them. I'm glad that they were able to attend. Someone in the audience suggested we should take that. We should take that AI talk on the road. We did.
No.
AWS was up there. Juniper Networks was there with me too, and it was a really fun conversation. I enjoyed that one.
Oh, good. Well, maybe we should have them on the pod.
Yes, I think that's a good idea for the future. But today, I am so excited for our first playbook. Annual planning. I mean, we're doing
Yes.
this on a Saturday afternoon because I have been buried, besides speaking at Spark, in annual planning for the last few weeks. And I'm sure everyone else, especially those on a calendar year, I'm on a fiscal year. So my year ends at the end of January, but I can't imagine on a calendar year, you're even more buried at this point. And so it is timely, I think, for most of us out there right now.
And when I say buried, or when Tiffany says buried, I think you should know that Tiffany has unlimited capacity. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. We all joke in our friend group that she literally has unlimited capacity, and I think she's hitting it. I think you're hitting a block to your capacity. She has asked for help, you all.
Yeah,
So
I
that just
have.
says why important this topic is.
Yeah.
Because it should be this important. It should be something you're spending a lot of time on. But not every company does this well. There isn't a playbook to do this well that I've seen. And so let's do that here today. Let's kick
Yeah,
it off.
I'm super excited to kick this off. So, I want to start, Kelly, with a question for you. And I think we might have different viewpoints on this. What is the most important part of annual planning from a revenue side in your perspective?
Ooh, great question. Most important thing is that everyone is involved. I think the biggest issues I've seen with annual planning in the past are where you forget to involve professional services, or you do pieces of professional or planning around things, but you forget to make sure that marketing's involved because
Yes.
they're also out there creating plans. So I think the most important thing is making sure there's no silos. That would be my concise answer. It took me a while to get there. Sorry about that.
That's okay. No, and I do agree with that, but I think and it's not too different from what you're saying, but I think the most important part to annual planning is actually setting your high objectives for the next year ahead of anyone starting their planning. I think I've talked about it in my current role, and I think we still stumble into this mistake, and I've made it every year. I don't think, and I'm sure there's no one that's doing it perfectly out there, but I think if as a business you can set your clear not your like smart goals or your KPIs, but like what's your vision for next year? Like what are those 3 or 4 main objectives or outcomes that you want at a high level? I think it really sets the tone so that even without getting to that step that you're talking about of people needing to be on the same page, you're starting from the same mindset. You're starting from the same like endpoint in mind. And I feel like if we were able to do that consistently, and for me, again, in a fiscal calendar, like say in August, come out of the first 2 weeks of August, the beginning of the second half, and say, this is what's working this year, and here's what those objectives are going to be next year. I think that planning would just start more smoothly if we were doing that.
Yeah. You are so right. And I think this gets missed because KPIs in revenue orgs tend to be different by team. And so if
Yes.
you can land this early, so often I see sales leaders. I have probably been one of these sales leaders where you have thoughts in your head like, we need to update our comp plan. It's a mess, or
Yes.
I have some org design issues. And you start moving forward with all of those little things that are actually pretty tactical in the details. And you forget to start with what you just mentioned, the most important thing, which what are those ultimate goals you are all going to be driving towards that will move the needle and make a difference for your board or whoever you're reporting up to.
I mean, when you think about it, the way planning typically starts is finance gives you something to produce, whether it's a cost envelope that you need to meet to. If you're in a revenue org and planning for a revenue team, you're building up to a sales target and you're trying to align on productivity with your quota bearing reps and like how many more can you add and what are the right blends of all of those things, like what's the right ramp time, like you're running all of these things and people are building up to a cost envelope and they're doing it in silos and you want to come back together, and that's always part of what the planning process is. But when you come back together after you've done that step, then you're already misaligned. Like you're starting on a bad foot and you're trying to figure out like why marketing wants to plan all of these campaigns that have nothing to do with the org design that's been in your head that you just put on paper to give to finance. It's probably one of my most frustrating points, and it's why I've been buried the last few weeks. And at my capacity, we've tried so hard this year, and I think we've done a decent job where I'm at Hacker One today of getting better like alignment and all these cross functional discussion points. But we still have to stitch things together, and so trying to do that while you're also building your plan is like where I think people start to like feel the stress at this part of the planning process.
So I am going to get tactical at this. How does this work? Is this a meeting? Is this a series of meetings? How have you seen this done well? Or if you haven't seen it done well, like how would you ideally like to see this go?
Let me tell you what hasn't worked, what I've tried in the past that I don't feel like is the answer. A series of meetings, like just this meeting cadence, just to have a meeting cadence to everyone check the box on a weekly basis doesn't work well enough because everyone has to go back in their silos. I don't think that that works really well. Having some gigantic like smart sheet spreadsheet or monday.com board or Asana or whatever you use also doesn't work because you don't have, unless you're at a really big company, and I'm not, you don't have project managers and program managers like chasing all those updates, so things get out of whack throughout the week, and so you're not in the weeds. I think what I think you have to do, and what I am always striving to do, is build that like, what are we all moving forward to in our goal at the beginning and align on that, even if you don't get it at the company level. So this year, we hosted an offsite with all those cross-functional teams. Finance, marketing, the services side of our business was there. Legal was there. HR was there, to talk about what our strategy was going to be from a long-term perspective for the revenue org and what we thought was going to work to play out in our upcoming fiscal year. And for the cross-functional teams to ingest that and tear it apart and tell us their thoughts. Like, for example, we talked about going into a new market and marketing said, ooh, that's much more expensive than you're scoping it to be. And I don't know that I'm going to get the cost envelope. So now I'm not off building a whole bunch of headcount and growth off of that market because marketing told me upfront that's probably not our best idea right now. So we're trying that this year, but we're in the middle of it. So we'll see where it goes. We're still having all those, intermingled meetings, but we don't have quite that same cadence series that I've done in the past that I don't think does anything but take up an hour of my week to run through a checkpoint. I don't know. I mean,
Totally
you've
fair.
been involved in it from a sales side perspective, from an enablement perspective. I'm curious, like, what were and all the M&As you did? I feel like those are mini plannings in and of themselves. Like, what have you seen? Have you seen something that you feel like works really well?
Yeah. So I will say, High Spot, who I'm no longer employed with, but have been for the last 3 years, they do this really well. They do, though, different than what you said, have a PMO assigned part of the annual planning process. And I actually think that's really important, even if your organization, so we'll maybe disagree here, but even if your organization is not huge, someone who can go out to the different silos and bring people together and make sure it's happening, just that person in charge, I do think is really important. In this case, I think it's probably you, Tiffany, at your org, or someone in finance. But we have that PMO, bring everyone together, and we start exactly what you just said. Finance comes with, here's what your envelopes are, here's what your growth targets are.
Mhm.
And it's kind of, we don't care how you get to the growth targets, and we don't care exactly how you spend the money, but you have to stay within this envelope. And the thing that they do really well is this conversation around initiatives. And so we get
Mhm. Yes.
marketing, we get professional services, we get sales, we get all rev ops, we get enablement, and we get all the sales leaders in a room, and we have the hard conversations of what are there those 4 or 5 things that we want to do to drive the business next year, and then the associated goals to those. And that's where you start. And typically this looks like an offsite. It is something you cannot do in an hour. And I agree with you.
Yes.
Those weekly series of meetings where you're trying to do this over a 6-week period don't work either. You need to lock yourselves in a room, and you actually have to get really serious about what this looks like. And you kind of have to agree to disagree at the end that this is where you're headed. And when you have all of those different silos and groups in the
Mhm.
same room agreeing to this, even if you start doing some individual planning, because you can't all work together at the same time.
Right.
You have to break off in different work streams, which we should talk about here in a second. But as you break off into those work streams, you're all going towards those same goals. And I think it's so.
PMO is probably one of the most underrated or maybe the hardest role to enter into a smaller organization during growth phase. Everyone wants a doer, like they want someone that they can attribute like a direct project or ROI to. And I've found we don't have that currently at HackerOne. And it took a while at DocuSign while I was there to really sell parts of the business, at least within the ops world, that we were ready for a PM. Like we needed one. We had a PMO that was very product focused. And so we were really on the operation side, the revenue side. Like I was a big advocate that we needed a PM within our broader team. And it took a while to convince the business because you want another doer that's building a sale, like building on your sales force or able to implement systems or to answer cases if you're in RevOps or to run deal desk, or those things all have like a very tangible component to them. But the PMO part of the business just makes things run so much smoother. So I totally agree. And I mean, it's great that HighSpot has that. One day we will. But right now, and I think in a lot of organizations that don't have it, finance often plays that like singular role in the planning process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's usually either RevOps or finance.
Hmm.
We should have a whole other series on PMOs in general because I have a lot of thoughts there. But I do think it's so important for alignment, and that PMO needs to report to someone in the business who can make them a little bit neutral in decision making so that everyone feels like they're being supported in the same way.
Yeah. And to that point, so I think you're right. It's finance or RevOps. And really, at the end of the day, in our role, partnering with finance is probably one of the biggest keys to success in actually executing your planning process.
Yeah. I think oftentimes I see failures where finance doesn't know the details of the execution plan, and then there's surprises. And to your point around going into a new market, a new industry is maybe more expensive or less expensive, or you're not considering the cost of some of the expected attrition or all of those other pieces
Or
that,
currency, like
oh my God,
are you gonna have
yes,
to
all
sell
the
in a
things
different
to overlook.
currency? Yeah,
It's so important that
totally.
you have finance really involved in a really good partnership there.
What are some of the other components? What are some of the other components of annual planning besides that like cross-functional alignment and really being lock in step with finance specifically? What are the other teams you think you need to be like super close with? You mentioned services was one of them.
Yeah, services is really important. I think they often get forgotten because of org structure, frankly. A lot of times the services org or the customer success teams report up to a different leader. And in
Yes.
those cases, if you're planning to grow by 30%, that means you're going to have 30% more customers to support. And so you need to make sure that those organizations are prepared for whatever growth and can actually handle the onboarding that you're expecting. I think the other thing that's so important is having those really hard conversations around churn. So you might have a 30% growth number, but if you haven't considered what your expected churn is based on the market, and we all know in SaaS right now, churn is high, people are concerned about retention, you're going to fall flat on your growth numbers because you haven't considered the churn and that's impact.
Yeah, and I think the churn is super important too because not only how much churn will you have for like a net growth perspective? That churn impacts the capacity that your services team needs. So if you don't account for that, you may be allocating too much cost envelope over to services to meet up with the growth that you're setting out when you don't need that much cost envelope. But then also, can you model who is going to churn? Is it going to be your large enterprise customers and it's a lot of dollars but not a lot of logos? Or is it a bunch of your commercial space that just doesn't have the funding right now and they're kind of cycling through tools and whatever you may be? And so maybe that's in your one to many, services model space, or maybe they have a really big, a high support call in ratio. Getting to that level of detail, I think, and providing those assumptions or doing that work, if you're not doing it today already in your planning, really helps to make sure the services organization can build a model that's truly aligned with where and how you think your growth will come from. I mean, we model all this stuff out and then the year just happens, right? Like there's only
Yeah.
so much you can do, right? You're ultimately like looking for the actual like growth number. Have you ever partnered with services to the degree where you're doing more iterative planning with them throughout the year?
I think you have to. So I spent the last 3 years in enablement, and I think to your question before, what's one other team that often gets left out? And I've talked to a lot of high spots customers about this. It's enablement. And the
Hmm.
reason that that's so scary, and this goes back to professional services, is if they aren't in these conversations and aren't aware, just for onboarding, there's so many other things, but just think onboarding of new hires. If you're expecting to grow your sales team by X%, or you're considering a big comp plan change that's going to require behavior change, you've got to be able to support those things through enablement. And if they don't have that on their radar, they're probably not going to be staffed appropriately or have the right org design. Sorry for that cough. So you have to think about how you bring them in as well to these conversations. And to that point, I think when you're thinking about other teams like professional services that service your customers, you have to be bringing on the right level of talent. So to your point, if we're going to start growing by 30%, but we expect 20% of that to be large enterprise customers, we need to make sure that we're onboarding services people who can actually handle
Yes.
large enterprise customers, not individuals who are more comfortable in the SMB space. And so I do think that that planning is very iterative and something you have to look at almost at a quarterly basis, but you need some baseline as you go into the year.
So I think to that point, then the other side of that coin from services is marketing. So being super aligned with marketing so that you're doing like your example there, you are making a bet, an assumption that it's all going to be enterprise focused. That's the profile that you're hiring for in your growth, where you're orienting maybe your quota to from a growth perspective and your assumptions. So you lockstep with services and enablement for those conversations, but you have to make sure that marketing is aligned from, you have to do the work to have an ICP conversation. Are you doing the right an ICP is ideal customer profile or account based marketing or ABM work? And how does that flow through to lock in that you're getting the leads and the conversations and running the campaigns that go after the customer profile of who you're saying you're going to land? Like you really do have to waterfall these assumptions. It's not just the numbers on the paper part of the planning process.
I've seen that forgotten so many times where there's a decision to go after enterprise. Marketing then is brought into the conversation, but no one brings in RevOps or marketing operations depending on how it's organized. And so there isn't the updating of the database of the leads that you need to target that new ICP. And so
Yes.
you spend 6 months behind because you didn't
Mhm.
bring in the right groups early enough. And so I think you have to think about the work back schedule on a lot of this stuff. Great, you want to go after enterprise, but when are we actually going to be ready to go after
Yes.
enterprise? Is it day one of the new fiscal year? Or is this something that's going to take us 6 months to work up to? And so we need to adjust quotas and we need to adjust growth and all of these other metrics to those timeframes. Not everything starts on Jan 1 or Feb 1, whenever your new year starts.
Totally. And to that point, it can start before Feb 1 or Jan 1 or whatever that date is, right? If you align on something that is going to be part of your next year's fiscal strategy, there's no reason that that decision or change has to wait until then, right? If it's really disruptive, like a comp plan change or a quota increase, like obviously those make sense. Like let's backload those and set them up for when they're appropriate. But if you know you're going to go after enterprise, changing your marketing spend now. Hire more SDRs or BDRs if you need those to go after from a, an outbounding perspective, because it gives you better runway. You don't have to wait for that that date to fall for everything to start changing. And I think when you wait for that date to fall, the changes feel bigger. And from an enablement perspective, like that change management just becomes a mountain that you have to climb.
Totally. I think the other thing you have to think about is when you make changes like that, you're making sales motion changes, but you're also changing org design. And
Yes.
that typically results in hiring different types of talent than you've hired before. And I've seen so many organizations fall flat in the great beginning of the year. We will make sure recruiting, also another team you need to bring into the
Yes.
conversation.
Yes. 100%.
Are they prepared to start hiring all these people? But if you need to start making your numbers at the beginning of the year, you need to, knowing ramp times are 3 to 6 months,
Mhm.
depending on what type of seller you're hiring, you
Yes.
need to hire them a ways back. And so you need to have recruiting in that play and in that game. And not always can they support that at the time you need
Yeah.
it.
Yes. So one of the things that I've done, and we can spend more time on this in a later part of the playbook in its own series. But one of the files that I've worked off of that I learned from my days at DocuSign is called a quota bearing sales rep, or QBSR file, where I take the entire organization from the individual and build up month over month exactly where I think that everyone's going to land. And what I do then is build in not only attrition, not at the named level, but we assume some percentage of attrition, and then the
Absolutely.
backfill logic, like how long after that attrit happens do we expect a backfill to actually be filled, as well as all the new headcount that we're layering in. That's something you can take then to finance to build up from a bottoms up capacity plan perspective, but also to a recruiting team and say, here's the summary of all the hiring. Is this going to work? And you can have those conversations. And I think a file like that and a structure like that is really important because it's recruiting capacity. So do they need to hire someone or outsource someone or find a way to do that? It's recruiting locations, right? Are you making the right assumptions on the cost envelope on like what that location is going to cost if you're hiring a new profile or in a new region? And both of those things are really important. So yes, the recruiting piece is another one. It's a good call out. I feel like that does get missed a lot of the time.
Yeah, I almost forgot about that one. But yes, super important.
We never forget about recruiting.
Don't ever
Always
forget
recruiting.
about recruiting. No.
But I mean, it goes back to your other point on enablement. So if you're letting recruiting know about something, your enablement team needs to be in the loop on both like what you think your attrition and new hiring planning might look like you expect 15% attrition and replacements through the year, as well as what that hiring plan looks like. It's not going to be perfect, but they can plan then from an onboarding perspective. Who and when is are we going to have heavy onboarding periods? Are they going to happen this year? So not only do you want to share that information with recruiting, but your enablement team as well, because you want them to be prepared for the influx of new hires based on your growth, or the amount of performance management you think you're going to be doing based on where everyone's at today, or the attrition that at least you're planning from a model perspective. So both recruiting and enablement need to be in the know there. And from an enablement perspective, you also want to make sure your enablement team isn't signing up for initiatives that won't work with the workload that's coming, right? Especially in smaller companies where everyone's doing everything. You don't want to do a big project to revamp onboarding if you're going to have a ton of new hires through the whole first half of the year. It wouldn't make sense to set your enablement team up for that, because there's no way they could be successful in both running a significant amount of onboarding and rebuilding the entire program.
There's just so many different implications. I think let's go back to our enterprise selling example. Typically, those reps ramp faster because they have a history of selling before. They sometimes come with a Rolodex. They oftentimes are walking into some pipeline, so are able to close deals a little bit faster. And so if you aren't building in those new predictive ramp time models with finance into your growth models, you also come into challenges. So there's just so many different
So
things,
many.
like the matrix of information that you need to have all
Yeah.
in one place is huge.
Yeah, it's funny you say enterprise ramp time is faster, because it's the opposite for us. So it's so unique, right? It's a piece of analytics that you have to do as part of planning. And you have to recheck that every few years and say, are my ramp assumptions still holding? Like, do I need to change those assumptions? And that always gets down to, finance wants them shorter. They want productivity faster. Enablement, then is told like you need to make people productive faster. Enablement says like they need better territories, or they need this, or they need that. And it becomes this own initiative all on its own every time you touch that. So, I mean, this is where annual planning just becomes its own thing, because every decision you make blows up into 10 people being involved and making sure you've connected all the right pieces. But at the end of the day, no one's doing this perfectly. Like if you are attempting to connect everyone and turn over every stone, then you're doing the best you can and you're going to miss a few things. And that's why iterative planning and those check-ins every quarter with a services or a marketing, like, is this working the way we thought? And if it's not, let's tweak it. It's not a one and done process. If it is, like, you're never going to be successful at annual planning.
So at the beginning of this pod, we talked about what's most important, and I want to throw out one more thing:
Yeah.
communication. So
Yes.
you're coming together, you're setting these KPIs, you're setting these big initiatives, then you're kind of going off in your work streams and making some decisions. The one thing that you can also have failure at is if you don't bring those people back together to share those decisions and the impacts they make. And so something I've seen done really well is that you actually come back for a day. Each team or organization, whatever it is, goes through and presents their plan, and they talk about the impact or the requirements that they need from other teams to be successful. So
Mm-hmm.
they have to think about, if I'm successful, what do I need from everyone else? And those asks get called out in that group setting, and people say, yep, I can commit to that, or no, I can't. We've got to rethink this. If you aren't having those honest conversations and you're just making assumptions, we know assumptions are bad, that's where you're going to run into trouble. So I do feel like you have to come back at the end, have these final conversations on all the decisions that have been made, and make sure you all agree you can support each other in the way that you need to.
I think that it's very easy to say that and very hard to execute on that, because my question
Totally.
to you would be when, because the end is not the right answer, right? Like if you zoom out and
Not
think
just at the
about
end. Yeah.
a planning timeline, right? Ideally, you start with initiatives and ideas. Worst case, you start with financing, like here's your cost envelope and your growth targets. Everyone does their best to interlock. They create these plans. Your executive team reviews them, makes discussions. Finance says you need to iterate. You're too far here, you're too low there. Everyone kind of ingests those, takes them back. It's a little harder to iterate because you have a shorter time period for that iteration. And then you're presenting to the board, and the board is saying, nope, cut that by X amount, or like, I only want to do, this much cash burn, or whatever those metrics are. And you blink and all of a sudden everything's locked. And now you're working under the confines of what the board approved. And I think that a lot of companies, and I've been part of these teams, you do what you're describing after that board lock is what I've seen happen. And it's way too late. People
Way
are
too
saying they
late.
can't do things. And the revenue team is saying, but I committed to a growth number. But how am I supposed to grow if you're saying you can't do that? And they're like, well, I didn't get the budget to run that campaign or to have that many onboarding people or whatever the question is. And so I think baking in what you just described early enough, like somewhere in that second or third rev, which for us is like the
Iteration of
November
it. Yes.
timeline, with enough space to actually make the changes if you find something like there isn't enough capacity or people, that you are going into the mindset that you can ingest a change. I think that's the other key, is not just doing it to check the box, but actually having an open mind that like the plan is not an iterative phase. We might need to significantly change something if we find a disconnect in this part of the process.
I also think you failed if you walk into that meeting and you're surprising someone. So if you walk in
Yeah.
and you are changing something and marketing says they can't support it, it means that you are not working across silos well enough, because you should have had that conversation on the cost to them, the timeline to them, all of those things previously. And so I really strongly believe that you're doing something wrong if you're coming into that meeting with surprises. But I also, going back to what you said, should be a couple iterations of this. You should have some check-in points in your annual
Hmm.
process where you're saying, okay, here's step one, here's step two, and here's where we lock it. And you need to figure out what form factor this takes place. Is this in a PowerPoint deck? Is this in a strategy memo? I'm a huge fan of strategy memo,
I know.
not just a PowerPoint. I think it's really hard to execute on the details within a PowerPoint, but we all
You're
have
selling
different
me on this.
things.
I'm changing my ways. I'm getting there.
You're getting
Yeah,
there.
I joke with one of my coworkers that we are PowerPoint Barbies, because I feel like that's how I've operated for so long, is like just producing decks. But you're convincing me. And I think for the comms point you made, it's totally true. Like you need to document in words and you need to socialize it.
Yeah. People aren't going to read outside of the people that are in the project your 50, I mean, it shouldn't be 50 pages, but whatever it is, your 20-page strategy memo. But you all need to read it and be aligned. And then I always like receipts. So we decided this. Oh, we want to change something. Let's all agree that we made a decision not to do this and
Yeah.
we're making a change.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good point that you document that. And again, on the comms, I think one of the things, and it's part of communications, in my opinion, is what you're really doing throughout this process is negotiation. You're negotiating with your cross-functional partners on what is the most important and how you should best get to these things, these go-to-market alignments that you're deciding on. And so that communication is so important. And I think in addition to that, the setup that you're describing, like those check-in points, setting the intention and what the actual outcomes of those check-in points, and not saying these are readouts or like let's just interlock, but saying like everyone needs to read this ahead of time. There should be comments from everyone on the documents. We are going to talk about only the things that have like concerns flagged in them, like whatever that process is, being super clear so that everyone's up to speed going in and you're using those times together to make decisions on things and not just talking or presenting. I think that that's also a trap from a communications perspective we fall into, where we feel like we're communicating, but we're not actually leaving room for the decisions.
Yeah, one thing I've seen also that's really effective, if you're lucky enough to have a PMO and a project manager on this, is to create a decision log. And so you
Mm,
know who was in the room and made the decisions, when they happened, what date they were made, because everyone has amnesia when it comes to annual planning, me involved. It's a lot. And so you need to have that documentation of what was decided and why.
yeah. I like that idea, decision log. I feel like that would come in handy. That's the receipts again. Yeah, I love a
Receipts. I
receipt.
like receipts. Okay, well, we clearly have a lot to talk about when it comes
Yes.
to this annual planning playbook. We're going to have some amazing guests joining us. So it's not just going to be Tiffany and Kelly, but we're going to have some amazing guests. Probably be 4 or 5 episodes. We'll see. But we are going to definitely talk about financial planning. We're going to bring in a sales leader. We're going to talk about professional services. We'll talk about execution. We're going to cover it all. So if you are in annual planning right now, you are thinking about what to do next, you want to up level your annual planning game, make sure you follow us for this series.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk about annual planning.
Absolutely. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Revenue Insiders. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a minute to leave us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners. Thank you.